We're going to make another transition now to hear from our third speaker, Dr. Rachel Lamb. So let me take a moment to introduce her. Dr. Rachel Lamb encourages Christians to live out their faith-informed commitments to creation care and climate action through her work on the boards of Arusha, USA, so you've heard that mentioned several times. She can explain a bit more about that. And also on the board of Tear Fund USA. She is one of the founders of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action and currently serves as a senior advisor to the organization. She's long supported the integration of faith and learning as a member of the faculty of Osawal Institute, regularly teaching summer courses in environmental science and policy. Vocationally, Dr. Lamb leads the Maryland Department of the Environment's efforts to advance nature-based climate solutions and to support forest, carbon, science, and research applications as an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. In 2015, Dr. Lamb was named a White House Champion of Change for her efforts in protecting our environment and communities from the effects of climate change. She earned a PhD in geographical sciences and master's degrees in public policy and sustainable development and conservation biology from the University of Maryland. She also graduated from Wheaton College with bachelor's degrees in environmental studies and international relations. So it's a privilege to invite Dr. Rachel Lamb to the podium. So thank you for being here.
Looks good. Well, good morning. It's great to be with you, and it's so great to go after Dr. Moerman and Caroline, because I can just give a +1 to a lot of what they said. I've been a long supporter of course, YCA and EEN, and just grateful for the opportunity to talk more about the work that we've done in partnership with them, but also through the work of both Arusha and Tear Fund. So just like Jessica started, I'd love to start by telling you a little bit about myself and how I also got into the field of climate action. So I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can actually see a picture of my church up here on the top left hand of your screen. My father was a Baptist pastor, and so my experience in that church was learning from a very young age what it meant to love God, what it meant to love God by taking care of our neighbors, particularly our local neighbors, and sort of was oriented towards this idea of mission, in maybe a more traditional sense of mission, but global caretaking, what it meant to love my global neighbor. And so in that sense, I think about the values and the commitments that that church community gave to me, and I find them to be precious. But there was simultaneously an interest in my life in spending lots of time outdoors. So I was an avid camper and hiker, and my father actually, who was the pastor of the church, led a lot of trips with young people, with couples out into canoe trips, wilderness parks. And so that very raw experience in creation itself helped me develop an appreciation and a care for the world God created. But on one hand, I had my deep care and commitment to loving God and loving my neighbor, and I had an interest in maybe studying the environment and thinking about what it meant to care for it, but I actually didn't have a very good, clear orientation around how to connect them both. In fact, it wasn't until I was a senior in high school and that I realized I could actually vocationally study the environment with environmental science. And so I struggled a bit to figure out what it meant for me to do these things as a Christian. And so fortunately, I was able to go to Wheaton, and like many faith-based Christian institutions, it was foundational in helping me recognize that not only could I be a Christian and care about the environment, but that actually being a Christian meant I had every reason to care and that I should be doing it as a Christian, not in spite of being one. And so this was really a beautiful experience for me, and I realized how integrated actually the gospel was, that it was as much about the caretaking of people in my local community and global community as it was actually caring for the full community of creation. And one of the challenges that I experienced sort of coming out of that context into Wheaton was that I was admittedly a bit skeptical about climate change, mostly because I had never really heard anyone actually explain to me what it was or why I should care, just inherently that I should be wary about it, because it seems a little bit like people were fear-mongering around it, that it seemed like it was some kind of catastrophe, but didn't really drill home. But that changed for me because while I was in college, I received a research scholarship from the Environmental Protection Agency, which might also be triggering in some communities. And they said, well, look, we have an opportunity for you to go spend a summer in the Pacific Northwest working with our Tribal Trust and Assistance Unit. And actually what we'd like you to work on is learning and gathering stories from these communities, from tribes, around the changes that they were experiencing to help us as an agency figure out what it would look like to respond. So having not much context other than an interest in learning and listening and diving in, I spent some time both in Seattle and in Anchorage. Up here is some of the communities located around Cook Inlet. And it was inescapable for me. By listening to tribal elders talk about the changes they were experiencing with massive beetle diebacks in their forests, multiple 100-year floods, thawing permafrost, which affected some of their subsistence hunting and gathering, and the fact that warming trends in the local salmon streams was affecting their ability to persist for the next several generations to come, despite having been there for a very, very long time. And so what seemed like a very distant reality suddenly became very real, in that it was real people that I was talking to and meeting with that were experiencing significant changes in their landscape. And I was confronted by the fact that I had every reason to care, and yet to date hadn't been taking it seriously. And it was this experience that made me want to commit to doing what I can, my own part, but also vocationally, to figure out how to better serve these people, just like my many other global neighbors who are experiencing these changes. So while Alaska is often on the front lines of climate impacts, Alaska still seems far away for many of us. And one of the top line, I think, takeaway messages that I think Dr. Moerman emphasized well, and also Caroline, is kind of this phrasing. So climate change is happening now. It's not a future issue. It's not just a past issue. It's happening now. It is because of us, largely speaking, and it is serious. And I think this messaging was supported by some of the work that the American Association for the Advancement of Science helped to put together. And I want to walk through this really quickly, but I think it's a helpful synopsis of how we can enter into the conversation. So first of all, it's happening now. So we've talked a lot about what's shown in the center of these concentric circles about the drivers of climate change itself. So the drivers of the contemporary changes that we're experiencing are largely due to greenhouse gases and from land use change. How can we tell what the impacts are? Well, we move out to look at the changes in our climate system itself. So something like the fingerprint of the change that we can actually see on the landscape. So this is things like warming temperature or melting ice or global greening, which may surprise you. Actually, plants like CO2. And so in some cases, more CO2 in the atmosphere actually means more greening. We see extreme weather events. Again, what's located in this second round of this circle is what we can see visibly. But then those changes to the climate system also have impacts that are more broad on the human system, on the environmental system. And so you can see here heat stress, like we've talked about before, increasing food insecurity, failing fisheries, et cetera. So it's happening now, and we can see evidence of it. We can see the global fingerprint everywhere we look. It's also because of us. So although sometimes figures like this might look kind of scary, actually I find this one really interesting because one of the cool things about the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're some of the world's foremost experts on climate science. They look at all of the records that are out there and published, and they try to synthesize them, and they try to dissect what is it that we're actually seeing. And so they have models, and models also might be scary to you, but as a modeler myself, they can actually be really helpful tools at sort of projecting, well, what would be true in a case where, let's say, it was only natural causes, based on all the science, for example, that Dr. Moerman does. So they said, well, if we only were looking at the natural causes, then we'd expect the current record, the fingerprint that we see, to look something like that green band. Humans also have a range of different impacts, so we know that in some cases aerosols can have cooling effects. So if we just looked at aerosols by themselves, actually we might see a decrease in global warming. And if we were just looking at greenhouse gases coming from human sources or activities, it would be kind of that red band. So then what do you see? You see the black line, which is real observations, real track record, and you can see that its form follows pretty closely to what we are likely to see based on just the driving human impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's happening now. It is because of us, and it is serious. So sometimes when we look at that change in global temperature, we think that just an increase of 1 or 2 degrees can be really hard to understand its impacts, right? So I think one helpful analogy for this is something like a fever. If you have a fever and your fever spikes a couple of degrees, and especially if you're more vulnerable, like a child, and you're spiking multiple degrees, the situation gets pretty serious pretty quickly. So on a global scale, we see these different thermometers, again, taken from data from the IPCC reports, where they show that as you start to see an increase in global temperatures from about 1 degree C to 1.5 degrees C, which is probably where we are now, and we see it continuing to increase without any intervention, without any change, we start to see the risks of impacts increasing. So just for water, for example, we can see that already we have so many millions around the world exposed to water security and issues because of water scarcity. And if we were to see our global warming trend continue, again, without any other action or intervention, we could see severe, significant droughts, in some cases on average lasting up to 10 months. And that is different from maybe what we're experiencing now, up to 2 months. So it's serious because the trajectory without taking it seriously or doing something about it has significant cost for people and the planet. But it also has economic costs. So I find that this study, bringing it a little closer to home from the Brookings Institute, was taking some of the most significant drivers of climate impacts that are likely to show up in our economy. They picked several of them, including changes in agricultural yield, increased mortality, especially from heat stressors, coastal damage from increasing storms, and labor supply risk. And what you see is that in many parts, although it's inequitable and uneven, many parts of the US, these incredibly high fractions of county level income that are affected by climate-related stressors. So it isn't just affecting people's own health or their livelihoods and well-being, but it's showing up as a clear signal in the economy itself. And it's important to note that this is sort of a compilation of all those drivers, but as you can see, there are some places that are affected acutely, and that is in part due to maybe the labor economy, so especially agricultural exposure for the labor force. You can see that in terms of mortality, and given that there are already underlying environmental injustices in many parts of the rural South, those are just exacerbated and exposed here. And actually the storyline's kind of complicated because what you see in blue here is where in some places, in part because I said some plants actually like CO2, that agricultural yields might actually be increasing in some parts of the country. Maybe not through 2100, but over short periods of time, sometimes there are limited benefits, but not for everyone and not for all time. This kind of question around inequitable impacts, I think, is just magnified, of course, on a global scale. So as we've already been alluded to, the United States still remains the highest per capita emitter of any country in the world. Historically, it's the highest emitter in terms of gross emissions and continues to be the highest per capita emissions. But when we look at who is emitting the most, historically and in present, which are the darker red countries shown on the map, you see that it's there's kind of a difference in who's actually most vulnerable or on the front lines. So in the US, you actually see sort of a spatial pattern similar to the one I just showed you on the previous slide. But when you really look at the heart of where impacts are happening that are most acute, they're happening in the places where people have had the least responsibility for contributing to the problem to begin with. So it's serious. It's serious because of its impacts on humans, the planet, or the ecological system itself. It's serious because it has impacts on our economy, and it's serious because it's fundamentally inequitable. All right, so climate change is happening now. It is because of us, and it's serious. But there is much we can and we should do about it. And I use both of these words intentionally because can implies that there actually are pragmatic and policy and technological solutions that can make a difference on the outcome, which I firmly believe is true. But the should here is actually speaking to a moral or ethical responsibility. And that is where I think we have a really unique opportunity to contribute to the discussions because of our distinctive Christian witness. So in general, what is a distinctive Christian approach? Well, Christians fundamentally act in response to who God is and what God has already done. So we act on climate, and we act and take it seriously with faith, with hope, and with love, because it's in response to God's love and mercy for his world. So when I think about this in the context of what we just shared, it sparks several questions for me. So given what we know about the causes and the impacts of climate change, it means that we can ask ourselves maybe what is loving or unloving about our current actions. And R could be individual, could be community, it could be nationally. There's a broad spectrum of R here. Secondly, we might ask what faithfulness and obedience to God looks like in this context. And third, we might say, what does hopeful living look like that includes not just a view of the future, or that includes a view of the future, not just the present situation. One of, I think, the foundational messages coming out of the Lausanne Cape Town commitment and their gathering back in 2010 was the following statement. So the Bible declares God's redemptive purposes for creation itself. Integral mission then means discerning and proclaiming and living out the biblical truth that the gospel is good news through the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ for individual persons, for society, and for creation. That means that all three, although broken and suffering because of sin, all three are included in the redeeming love and mission of God. And that means all three must be part of the comprehensive mission of God's people. That's us. So how do we work this out in the context of climate change? If I'm thinking about all of these three, we're asserting from the very beginning that acting in love on climate change is because we are showing that we love our local neighbor, our global neighbor, and our future neighbors. So we've already heard this again, and I'm going to reiterate it, that climate change impacts our health, our well-being, our securities, our livelihoods. And although it impacts everyone, the fingerprint is everywhere, it impacts the poor and the vulnerable first and worst. And the future generations, of course, as always, bear the brunt of the decisions we make today. I think that is particularly important in the context of climate change because we all here are inheriting the choices of people that came before us, and we are trying to navigate what it means to live responsibly in light of that. But our decisions have a direct impact on the people that come after us. And so our future neighbor is also an important, although sometimes it feels hard to think about who that neighbor is because they might not be here yet, it is a part of an ethical response to climate change. These are several examples on the screen of what I think about when I think of my local and global neighbor, but it expands to my local neighbors in Baltimore who, as we've heard about, are suffering from urban heat island effects that are exacerbated by a warming world, particularly Black and brown communities. I also think about my neighbors in Alaska and the tribes like those in the village of Kivalina whose actual land is eroding and falling into the sea, and at some point they're going to not have any other choice but to relocate and move. So what does it mean to support them and advocate and help them in slowing the pace of change but also helping them adapt? And then it's also like local communities in Malawi who have actually been very good agriculturally at managing the changes in weather patterns from year to year, but those the reliable weather patterns that they used to farm around are not the case today. And so thinking about the frontline impacts from drought, water insecurities, and food insecurities is front of mind for them and their children. But just as we're talking about love for our neighbor, I also want to assert that it also means love and care for God's creation itself. And as I'm going to emphasize again and again, people are part of creation. So when I mean creation, I mean people and the rest of non-human creation. But there is a special place for us to actually advocate for the well-being of non-human creation itself because of its value that God gave it. And climate change is actually stressing ecosystems in unprecedented ways. So ecosystems are very good at usually adapting and are fairly good at being resilient. But what climate change is doing is forcing them out of historical norms and exacerbating current threats like land use conversion or invasive species. And so often species themselves are kind of in a dilemma because they either have to figure out how to adapt in place, even though the pace of change is quicker than they've ever experienced before. They have to move to keep up, they have to migrate, or they ultimately face extinction. So one of my local examples here, because if you're from Denver, you gotta love Rocky Mountains National Park. Rocky Mountains and the Alpine region is actually the front lines of fingerprints of climate, and you're seeing traumatic and dramatic changes in the biological community there as moisture gradients change with snow melt timing changes. And the pika here, the cute little rodent with grass in its mouth, it actually is one of the species that is acutely affected by those changes. We often don't think of the pika when we're thinking about taking action on climate change, but actually God loves the pika because he made it and he called it good. And so its well-being is actually part of the reason why we should take it seriously. And so the loss of biological diversity, of course, is sad and sorrowful, not only because it's a loss of the diversity that God made, but it also is reducing the range of ecosystem goods and services that people rely on. There's a lot of reason, however, for hope. And one of the things that I often remember is that God gave us the greatest hope by demonstrating love and life through the death and resurrection of his Son. And that means not only do we have hope here in the present, but we have hope that he's completing his restoration work, which means all the work that we do now point back to that greater hope for shalom and restoration that he's already provided for us. And so to me, I don't think of biblical hope as rooted in naive optimism that it'll all just be fine, it'll all get taken care of, I don't need to worry about it, but actually digging in and pursuing restoration of relationship, restoration of these systems that are negatively impacted by climate change is an action rooted in the confidence in God's promises to us. And so this restoration points to the kingdom yet to come and then works itself out in very practical, pragmatic ways. So you can see here from this figure a range of ways in which nature-based solutions, so restoring our wetlands, our forests, our agricultural systems, actually work together to build more resilient systems for the people that depend on them. So you'll see some examples like hazards being landslides or losses from extreme flooding events, and actually how working to protect and restore forests helps stabilize soils, reduces runoff, makes a healthier forest community, and directly supports the people who would otherwise be acutely affected. Another example might be the loss of livelihoods based on sea level rise. I live in Maryland. Sea level rise is happening. It's affecting our coastal communities. Their ability to farm on the coast is actually being affected by saltwater intrusion, meaning they're not going to be able to do that for the next generation or two. So how can I maybe provide a buffer? How can we restore wetlands? How can we think about how to help them adapt their livelihoods? When I think about restoration, I think about restoring people and places, and I think about that both from an ecological point of view and from a human community point of view. So ultimately then, to me, what faithfulness looks like is intentionally and without sort of the weariness that can sometimes be the case, pursuing mutual flourishing. To assert that if God cares about all of it together, then solutions need to find ways where people and the systems that they live in, that they depend on, are also thriving. And just like we know that humans are the primary driver of the change that we're experiencing, they also can be a primary driver, with the Lord's help, on actually advancing solutions that make a difference. It's not a problem that is too big, even though it feels like it. There's actually much we can do. And I'm always reminded that we always have the capability to make new choices. Yes, we do live in a world in which we experience the consequences of the decisions we have made and that our world has made. They're serious. But it doesn't mean we have to keep doing the same thing. We actually have an opportunity to, even in the cases where we've seen failure and we haven't seen mutual flourishing, insist that we can do better and to dig in. And I think that requires identifying the spheres of influence that we have and taking actions that intentionally point towards that mutual flourishing, looking at the whole community of creation together. So while I'm emphasizing, for example, that climate change affects the entire community of creation, I do want to spend a moment to emphasize the fact that in most conversations that I hear or I have about climate change, the conversation often centers value on people, on humans. It's actually a fairly anthropocentric viewpoint. And in a secular context, what often happens, and I don't think the church is removed from this, we'll come back to that, but one of the things that happens, given the work I do in conservation and in sustainable development, is that people either focus all of the work on, we care about taking climate seriously and we care about restoring nature because of people, despite any other reason, as if no other part of creation has value independent of its connection to people. That's one maybe extreme. And then on the other extreme, because there's a fight sort of against that, it's like, well, hey, aren't people also part of nature? They're kind of arrogant to think that they're the center of all things. And so there's actually a push to think about conservation and restoration of nature that actually excludes people, because if people are the problem, then we'd be better off without them. And so what you have is these two extremes, and often what people find themselves doing is picking some place on this spectrum. I think about it like a rope. If you're playing tug of war, you pick your spot on the rope and then you just keep pulling for your side. And I find this to be completely frustrating because actually what we have an opportunity to do as adopting a Christian worldview is to actually assert that Christianity and the Christian worldview, a theocentric worldview, actually goes beyond the spectrum and reframes the entire locus of value in the conversation. So instead of having an egocentric or perhaps anthropocentric worldview, where ultimately everything is only about people, or fighting an ecocentric worldview in which people are, as the dear ecologist Aldo Leopold said, plain members and citizens of the larger biological community, it actually asks us to consider whether there is a different way that actually puts people in their right place within the rest of the created order, and gives us a liberating view to pursue mutual flourishing together. There's a lot I could say about this. I want to highlight that two of my colleagues, Dr. Ben Lowe and Dr. Ruth Padilla-Boris, wrote a paper on this. Really because of our experience in both that conservation and development context, where you often feel this tension all the time, wrote a paper sort of explaining in the context of global environmental change, in the context of a warming world, what would it look like if we were actually adopting a theocentric point of view, a worldview. That inherently is what Christianity is about, because the whole narrative scripture is about God and God's purposes of the world, and we find our value and purpose because of that. And so we kind of took a look at this and unpacked some of the ways in which people have sort of framed this debate, and where kind of it showcased pragmatically in a lot of the solutions that are framed. And then offer that there's several implications for adopting a theocentric worldview. So there's a lot we could say here. I'm going to just keep it high level. But it is only when we align ourselves with a theocentric worldview, so again, with God and God's will at the center, that we can also inevitably pursue right relationship with each other and with the rest of creation itself, including tackling really challenging global environmental changes like climate change. So if we are putting God at the center, as we ought to be, it has several implications, including first, it fosters humility. So it's not just about us at the center, about what we can and cannot do, but it's a reminder that it's about God and his desire in the world. Because it's often our arrogance and our attitudes of domination that actually mess things up. So when we're reminded about who God is and our place because of what he's done, it helps us remind ourselves that we are a beautifully, wonderfully made part of creation, and as we'll talk about in a moment, have unique responsibilities, but we aren't at the center. We aren't the pinnacle. It also helps us reassess value. So we know God's intrinsic value is bestowed to people, but he also called all of creation good before humans were even created. And that intrinsic value of non-human creation is beautiful, which means it has that right to be here and to thrive and flourish independent of its utility to us, even though we all know we're heavily dependent on it for our own well-being and flourishing. It also helps us affirm human responsibility. So we know that we have a unique capability in the way that God's gifted us and given us an opportunity to serve him in this world as image bearers. And I think it also affirms that we have responsibility to then act in this world in a way that would reflect God's care for it, which means pursuing health and healing and restoration wherever it needs to happen. And in essence, taking seriously anything that stands in contrast to that, which I would argue includes taking climate change seriously and figuring out what it means for us to act in light of that. I think it also helps us embrace inner relationship. So we have to remember that we are created, so we are part of creation, and actually humans and species share a level of kinship in that sense because we share the same creator. That's kind of an ecological principle that I think is beautiful and gets worked out here. And that means as the entire community of creation, we're being reconciled and redeemed through the love and mission of God. It also helps us recognize God's involvement in the world. So God is deeply engaged in the world that he loves and he cares for, and he's involved in ways that we don't always understand and that don't always involve us, which means it frees us from having to try to save the world as if it's all on our shoulders and lets us instead offer up our actions and our efforts as worship and witness to him. I find that also very freeing, that these things are complicated, and when we're trying to figure out what it means to pursue right relationship and mutual flourishing, we do that in community, we do that in working out the tensions, and I'm always reminded that by pursuing it, that we're defined not by success, but we're defined by faithfulness. It also helps us reframe conflict. So if God created the world to flourish in shalom, then there shouldn't be any inherent conflict between advancing the true interests of creation, both human and non-human. That doesn't mean there aren't tragic conflicts in the present, but that's because of sin and brokenness, which means that if it's not the way that they're designed to be, that it helps us not just look at a conflict and say it's completely irresolvable, but actually tries to address things at that point of tension and work together towards what we think the kingdom of God is meant to look like. And finally, it confronts idolatry. So it challenges any worldview or ideology that it attempts to center humans, our own needs, our desires, or any aspect of creation in competition with their creator and his desire for holistic shalom. And I find this often requires rigorous self-reflection, as is the case, to make sure that even there's a lot of ways that idolatry can show up in our lives in uncomfortable ways, but sometimes maybe my own, even like my own solutions or policies or preferences or convictions, sometimes if I'm holding on to those more tightly than I ought, that I find they might have actually superseded my primary allegiance, which should be to God and the things that he cares about. So in this paper, we mention a lot of organizations that are actually trying to live this out in practice. What does it look like to adopt a theocentric worldview and to affirm and pursue mutual flourishing in the context of such incredible amount of change? This is not a comprehensive list, but I want to highlight many of the organizations that I've served with or I support or I know about. We've heard about YCA and EEN. I work with Arasha, which is a global conservation and development organization. My colleagues from Tear Fund USA are here, and I'm so grateful for the work that Tear Fund is doing to talk about this work through the lens of justice. And also my colleagues from Plant for Purpose are here, which is a really great example, talking about tree planting and tree restoration as one example for how we can pursue mutual flourishing. There's a lot of good work happening, and I want to highlight two examples, which I think are attempts to really try to do this. One is comes from Costa Rica. So I was just there. Actually, the people that you see here in the middle are James and Ruth Padilla de Bors. And then you'll see Ben Lowe here. So all of us who wrote the Theocentrism paper were together in March. And we were there actually learning from James and Ruth because of the work that they're trying to do through Casa Adobe, which is a local, grew out of a local community effort to have a living community at their home, which is profoundly about just welcoming the stranger, providing a place for refugees, providing a place for people who might be struggling in their faith, and just being a community where they're open to discussing and dialoguing that, and trying to figure out what it means for them in community to actually serve their local neighbors. And so Ruth and James have been a part of this, and some of the work that's come out of this association is thinking about not only how to build out community, radical community there in terms of the people that they're welcoming in, but what does it mean to think about radical community, including the non-human parts of their community. And something that they've been really interested in is the river, which you see here, which is arguably one of the most polluted rivers in Costa Rica, that runs just next to the local neighborhood, which is one of the most impoverished in San Jose. And it's almost entirely inaccessible. It used to be the place where people could go and sort of enjoy picnicking or fellowshipping with each other, or using sort of the river as a resource. But it's completely polluted and blocked out and inaccessible. And in fact, the way they describe it is as if the community has like turned their back to the river and has sort of forgotten that it was there. And so they asked, what would it look like to fight for the health of the river, just like we're trying to fight for the health and well-being of this community that we live in. And so they've been actually working really closely with not only their community association, but working with the national government to figure out how to improve access to clean up the river, to actually do more intentional restoration through tree planting and other work that provides it access to green space where people can come and enjoy it, that it's safe to be there, and it's actually part of their witness back out to what it means to be a community that is centered in integral mission. So I think they're doing beautiful work there, and they're also a Friends of Inarasha group, which is one of the reasons why I was visiting. Another beautiful example comes from work in Haiti that was supported by Tear Fund and Tear Fund USA. So in the metropolitan area of Port-au-Prince, there is a huge challenge in the country, but also there a huge challenge with solid waste management. So this is not just a unique challenge to Haiti, but I think is particularly acute here. And so when you don't have a solid waste management system, then one of the challenges you often face is what to do with it. And so it might be common to throw it in the waterways, or it might be common to burn it. So open waste burning presents an immediate hazard to human health, thinking about all the things that you're breathing in when you're burning waste. It also has an incredibly challenging impact on air and water contamination, and actually is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in this tiny country. So in addition to the common sources like maybe agricultural related impacts or energy sources, open air burning ranks towards the top. And so one of the ideas here is how do we invest in young people who are incredibly ingenuitive and innovative, who might have solutions to bring to the table that are pragmatic, while also doing more advocacy to have the government think about how to stand up a more comprehensive solid waste management system. And so there was support for an organization that would go out and do a lot of waste collection, both organic waste and plastic waste. And for the plastic waste, think about ways that it could be processed and utilized for other kinds of construction purposes. And actually, that's a net climate benefit, because concrete, which is what many of us use, is actually a very dirty form of manufacturing. And so what they're doing is actually finding ways to take the waste, get it back off the street, and actually use it for materials that could support other kinds of maybe less carbon-intensive industry. And then actually thinking about how to use organic waste to serve the agricultural community in composting. And so I think, again, it's both this combination of how this kind of youth-oriented sort of drive for making the conditions in the ground for local people better, for their health, for their well-being, fighting for a different climate future, and then also doing more advocacy to think about system change. So these examples, particularly those in global context, I think provide a tremendous opportunity for us to bear witness in a world that is already talking about these issues. At a global scale, there are huge international initiatives, global treaties that involve most nations in the world, focused on how we're going to reduce our climate emissions, how we're going to scale ecosystem restoration, and how we're going to do it in a way that is good for people and for planet. And so this is the backdrop of the narrative that's already happening. And so the question is, where are Christians showing up in these spaces and actually talking about the why and the how? Because the why is also distinctive, but the how, especially if what we're doing is being ardent about pursuing mutual flourishing, might mean that we're looking for solutions that might go beyond sometimes what other people might just say is good enough. And so we have a tremendous opportunity to bear witness in a world that's talking about it and often feels Christians aren't showing up to the conversation. I'd also argue that to do this effectively, especially given that most people, maybe in this room I'm going to presume are Americans, is that it has to start at home. So as I already mentioned, the EPA, whatever you think about them, the EPA is responsible for actually quantifying the footprint of our emissions across all sectors of the economy every single year. And we work really hard to figure out how to quantify that and how to target those sectors which we can make the most sort of impact in collectively. So you can see this is a snapshot from the most recent inventory. You can see the range of course, gases, with CO2 being the most dominant one, but also methane, not just nitrous oxide also being particularly powerful greenhouse gases. And you can see that in a US context, maybe unsurprisingly, since we have a culture of owning our own vehicles and traveling a lot, the transportation is one of the most dominant impacts, followed closely by the electric power industry, including manufacturing comes next, and then a range of other commercial, residential, and land use impacts. So the point is, the US has a dominant impact in the global conversation, which means we're more credible when we show up to talk about what this looks like everywhere else, when we actually start by looking at what we're responsible for. And it doesn't just start with this kind of abstract national question, but it gets resolved even to a state scale. So just this week, I was with the governor's offices of all the states that are part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, including Colorado. Since I work for the state of Maryland, we're part of the alliance. And all the states are also trying to ask the same thing. Okay, we're a little more closer to where people live and work and where the economies are centered. So what does it look like for a state to understand its own impact? Where is the greatest source of emissions, and how can we move the needle on policies that enable and invite people to participate? But I can tell you that one of the things I wish was more true in these conversations is that when they talked about who the stakeholders were, who are the people coming to the table, telling them what they wanted to see in solutions, I wish they were saying that it was communities of faith, that they know are an active part of the thread of society and culture and caretaking, but those voices are not always translating into the way they're designing policies. And so how beautiful would it be is if we said, wow, there's actually a lot of science and actual work that backs up trying to understand what our impact is, and then we need more voices coming to the table to actually make policy better. And it really requires bringing, again, that ethical and moral imperative that is demanding solutions that are pursuing mutual flourishing that they need to hear. And so Colorado, I'm not going to talk about your whole wheel of emissions here, but your footprint might look different than Maryland's footprint. It might look different than California's footprint. But it's not as if we haven't made a start. So if we're planning on how to take action, like, how can you engage? And just finally, if you're not quite sure that you're not quite sure about policy and advocacy engagement, well, the good news, as we've already heard, is there are many ways in which you can start right within your own sphere of influence. And your own sphere of influence starts with what choices you make every day, what you do in the context of your households, of your family, with your churches, with your maybe the places where you work. And so our responsibility by starting at home means we can ask questions about what it looks like to better love our own place, the people that we care about, the places where we work and we live. We heard a little bit about Climate Stewards as an example of a tool that you could use to understand your footprint, just like all of these actors I told you before, like states and companies and national governments are trying to do. You can understand that too. And you can get support to interpret what it means and figure out like very practical things that you can do to take action. And like Arasha tries to do is extend our sense of place, again, not only to the people who are close and dear to us, the people that we think about like our children or our neighbors or other family members or our friends, but that it can extend to the full community of creation, that it can extend to the beautiful places where we might spend our time hiking or visiting or camping or just spending time in, that the flourishing and well-being of those places is actually part of the good news of the gospel too. And so in all of this, just invite you to do this because it's a way of bearing witness to a good God who's made a good world and invites us to faithfully love and serve him by fighting for the mutual flourishing of the full community of creation he's made.